Okay, our next topic here in Unit 5 will be about reflex arc, your reflexes and how those work. So this is just part of our neuron networking story, and the reflexes are the simplest examples of networking between neurons within the nervous system. So reflexes are inborn, or they can be either inborn or learned reflexes. Inborn reflexes, those are things that you're born with. They're also called intrinsic reflexes. They're rapid, they're involuntary, and very often they don't even involve the brain itself in decision making. A good example of one of those, like if you touch a hot stove, you jerk your finger away. And you actually jerk your finger away before your brain even registers the pain. Have you ever thought about that? I mean, your finger sometimes is off of that stove before you even realize that you burned yourself. And that's because that type of thing is a withdrawal reflex that is processed through the spinal cord. The reflex itself, moving your finger out of the way or off the hot stove. Now, information going to your brain about, oh, that was hot, I burned my finger, that's separate information that gets sent to the brain, and then your brain itself registers that pain sensation. Then there are reflexes that are called learned or acquired reflexes that result from things that you practice, repeat over and over again, like your driving skills, for example, or roller skating, riding a bike, dancing, those types of things. When you do things, you guys know that once you do things over and over again, you really don't have to think about it all that much anymore. All right, reflexes involve the following components. Or you have a receptor, that's what's receiving the stimulus, such as, like if you stuck your finger on a hot stove, the hot temperatures are a stimulus, and you have neurons that are programmed sensory neurons that detect those types of things. So often your receptor and the sensory neuron, the receptor is on the sensory neuron itself. The sensory neuron transmits that information to the central nervous system. Then you have an integration center within the central nervous system. Sometimes this is just entirely within the spinal cord itself, and it may either be monosynaptic, so that means it only involves one synapse, or polysynaptic, which means you've got a synapse onto this neuron, which then has a synapse with another neuron, which may have a synapse with another neuron before you reach a response. So you've got some communication through more than one neuron. Then finally, you've got your motor neuron, which is going to send out the efferent impulses, action potentials, to some sort of effector organ. Okay, so the effector may be a muscle fiber or a gland cell. And if it's somatic, then it's going to be a skeletal muscle fiber. Skeletal muscle is going to contract, if that's our decision we're making. Or if it's a visceral effector, like it may be smooth muscle within the walls of some organ, or a gland cell that's going to respond to this. It's going to have to make the effect happen. All right, so here's a very simple example of a reflex. If you stick a nail into your skin, we all know that's painful. So you have sensory neurons that will detect the damage from this stimulus of a nail. That'll cause them to generate an action potential, travels up here to the spinal cord. Here we have a synapse. There's an interneuron here. So this one secretes neurotransmitters, causes this one to depolarize and generate an action potential down its axon. It secretes neurotransmitters that stimulate this motor neuron to send an impulse out to muscle fibers in a muscle. So the effect would be, if you had your effect will likely be to jerk away from whatever it is that's causing the pain. You need to contract skeletal muscles to make that happen. Here's a good example of one of these reflexes that works entirely through the spinal cord. This is the knee-jerk reflex. Have you ever wondered why the knee-jerk reflex works the way it does? I'm sure we've all had a doctor tap on our patellar ligament. That's the ligament that extends from your quadriceps muscles across the patella and then connects into that tibial tuberosity. And so what happens when your quadricep muscles contract? Hopefully you remember that one of their main jobs is to extend the knee so that you stand up. All right, so when the doctor is hammering your knee in with a hammer, it causes your lower leg to head backwards like that, right? So that tendon is going to get stretched as your knee gets tapped, and you have sensors called muscle spindles within your quadricep muscles, and they detect that stretching because the muscle's not really contracting so much as it's just being stretched when your lower leg goes backwards, when you flex the knee. And so when this muscle spindle structure detects that stretching, you have sensory neurons there that send action potentials upward toward the spinal cord. All right, and then that axon, notice it branches, and this branch forms a synapse with this motor neuron, and notice we got a plus sign going on there. So it's actually stimulating this motor neuron to generate an action potential, and if we follow the axon, it's extending down to quadriceps muscles, so it's going to stimulate the quadricep muscles to contract. And what's the action of the quadricep muscles? Like your rectus femoris and your vastus lateralis, your vastus medialis. When they contract, you extend your knee, you kick your lower leg forward. Okay, so that's why when the doctor hits your knee with a hammer, your knee or your lower leg, you kick it out without even having to think about it. That is an example of a reflex that's taking place. Now let's follow the rest of what's going on here. Okay, so this sensory neuron, action potential, action potential, action potential, and it branched. Okay, and notice this one stimulates this interneuron here in green. It fires an action potential. But notice we've got a minus sign over here. So just because you have a synapse and a neuron releases neurotransmitters, these signaling chemicals, those aren't always stimulatory. Sometimes they're inhibitory. And so this interneuron is actually inhibiting this motor neuron. So neurons can stimulate other neurons, and in other cases they actually inhibit neurons. So now this motor neuron is less likely to generate an action potential. It's blocked from doing so. And if we follow its axon, where does it head? It's in control of your hamstring muscles, like your biceps femoris, or your semitendinosus, or your semimembranosus, whichever one. That one controls muscle fibers within. So those are your knee flexors. So why would we want those motor neurons, the motor neurons controlling your hamstrings, to be inhibited? Because if you're kicking your lower leg forward, you're extending the knee. You don't want muscle fibers in your hamstrings contracting at the same time that are trying to make you flex your knee. So this is your knee jerk reflex. It's an example of a stretch reflex. Now why do we do that? All right, so imagine you're standing up. Gravity is pulling on us all the time, right? We talked about muscle tone back in Unit 4 when we were covering the muscles, and how your muscles always have some state of contraction that's taking place. Imagine if we did not have that. Because of gravity, gravity would force your knees to flex, and we would just fall down to the ground if we didn't have our quadricep muscles helping us out with that. So probably subconsciously, without us even realizing it, our knees start to flex a little bit when we're standing up, and as soon as they do, these stretch receptors over here, these muscle spindles, they fire action potentials over here to the spinal cord, and boom, boom, this networking happens. Your quadricep muscles contract a little bit to keep your knee joint extended, and these motor neurons are inhibited from knee flexion. So it helps you stay in a standing position. That's the real reason why we have a knee jerk reflex. It's not so it just looks cool when the doctor is hammering on you with a with a hammer. So when they do that to you, they're just testing to make sure your nervous system function is undergoing properly. All right, so that's a stretch reflex that results in extension of the knee joint to help you stay standing up. We also have flexor reflexes, or flexor and crossed extensor reflexes. And all a flexor reflex, that's like a withdrawal reflex. You stick your finger on a hot stove, biceps brachii muscle contracts really rapidly to make you flex your elbow and jerk the finger out of the way. Okay, and again, you don't even have to think about that happening. That gets processed through the spinal cord. It's ipsilateral, so it happens on the same side of the body, and it is polysynaptic, so it involves multiple neurons. All right, now a crossed extensor reflex, what is that? Let's see one of those in action here. This is a cross let's see. Pen's not writing. Am I right down there? There we go. I don't know why it won't right up at the top. Cross extensor reflex. So think about like they're showing you here in the diagram. If somebody grabs your arm, what happens? Somebody grabs your arm, you immediately try to jerk your arm out of the way without even thinking about it. That involves flexion. But then what else do? You generally also with the other side, you extend the elbow, you force that arm forward. Like you might try to push the person out of the way. That's kind of a survival instinct type thing. That's called a cross extensor reflex. Or think about like if you stepped on a tack with your right foot. What are you going to do? You're going to immediately flex the knee to lift your foot up off the ground. What's going to happen over on the other side? You don't want to flex your left knee as well, because you're going to wind up falling down to the ground and right onto whatever it was that you stepped on with your right foot. So on the left-hand side, you extend the knee joint to help you maintain your balance and stay in place while you're picking the other foot up. So those are both examples of cross extensor reflexes. And so if we kind of follow along with our story here, you've got a stimulus, somebody grabs your arm. So you've got sensory neurons that detect that touch and pressure, and they send action potentials, blah, blah, blah. See, we're going through the dorsal root up here into the spinal cord. We've got some interneuron networking that goes on in here. And if you kind of follow along, we've got a plus sign along this red motor neuron here, and that motor neuron innervates the biceps brachii muscle, which makes you flex your elbow. So we're stimulating those motor neurons that control that muscle, and at the same time you're inhibiting your triceps brachii muscles back here, because if those were contracting you would extend the elbow, so we want those inhibited. But then meanwhile over here on the other side, you've got some interneuron networking that's taking place here, and eventually that leads to the opposite. The plus sign is on the purple neuron, motor neuron over here, and notice it's stimulating the triceps brachii muscles, which make you extend the elbow, and your red axon there is extending over to the biceps brachii muscle, and we want that one inhibited over on the other side of the body. So you have opposite responses on the two sides of the body. And another example would be, again, if you stepped on something hot or sharp, like a piece of glass with your left foot, you're going to flex the knee on the left-hand side, you're going to extend the knee on the right-hand side to help you stay in place. That's another example of a cross-extensor type reflex as well. So those are instinctive, intrinsic type reflexes that we're born with. They help us survive and help our bodies function properly, and the brain doesn't even have to get involved in processing that. So we've talked a lot about networking between neurons. In the next video lecture, we're actually going to get into a little bit more detail about this signaling that takes place, and then we're also going to talk about a little bit more about neurotransmitters, these chemicals that are involved in communications between neurons.